All right, everyone, welcome and thank you for joining us at this inaugural panel discussion of the Disaster Resilience Special Interest Group at the International Social Capital Association. I'm Dr. Jeff Donaldson. I am a secretary on the board of directors of the International Social Capital Association. I'm also the chair of the Disaster Resilience Special Interest Group. Our intent with tonight's panel is to start a discussion and have a conversation about disaster recovery being a long, difficult process of reestablishing civic systems after a significant event. Emergencies, disasters, catastrophes impact all sectors of our society, whether that be business, not-for-profit, community, and the public sector. We know that establishing social networks before the event, planning for recovery proactively, leads to better post-event outcomes. The challenge that we have is how do we encourage and facilitate the connections necessary for an entire community to work together before and after the event. It's a pleasure today that I'm joined by David Savarese and Timothy Little as panel members. We're going to go back and forth and have a conversation here. What we don't have is PowerPoint for you. We think it's more vital and valuable to everybody out there to have an ongoing discussion. It's an alternate format that we're offering to you. And when we're concluded today, we would love to have your feedback on whether you like this panel setup, whether you like this type of back and forth discussion, or whether you would prefer to have a expert in and give a presentation for 45 minutes on a specific topic with PowerPoint, or would you like to see both and one each has their own benefit? And so the mission of the International Social Capital Association is to bring together an eclectic group of people from around the world who are interested in studying social capital. We'll put the link in the chat to our homepage for the organization, and also an opportunity there for you to join Mighty Networks, which is our online platform that is free to join, free to put yourself to sign up on and create a profile on. And the Disaster Resilience Special Interest Group has a special page on that Mighty Networks where we often post different things and have back and forth discussions. So that'll be up there for everybody to see in the chat. And so not to waste any more time, we're going to start off our first question. I'm going to toss this one to you first, David, and then to Timothy. Based upon your experience in the field, how would you generally characterize the relationship between the emergency management field and the served public?
Hey, sorry. Thanks, Jeff. You mentioned I build a little credibility and share my background with y'all. I've been at Jacobs Engineering for 15 years, which is a large AEC company, and I've worked on recovery and mitigation programs in Northern California, US, the US Virgin Islands, the Washington, D.C., Riyadh, Tennessee, Virginia, Illinois, New York City, Oakland County, Florida, Harford County, and Providence, Rhode Island. I'm a certified planner and a chartered environmental manager, and my background, which is largely why I'm here and part of this organization, is in sociology and urban policy. I'm a huge advocate for integrated planning, disaster recovery, and long-term recovery planning. And I believe that there's 32 core capacities related to emergency management and threat and hazard identification and the creation of solutions and responses both before and after disaster. While I think we have room to grow and to share some of our capabilities across the discipline, sharing between emergency managers, adaptation planners, environmental managers, and so on, it becomes increasingly important for us not only to share skills, but also to know when to defer and to fall back on the reliance of the core discipline. One of the most important things anybody working in this space can do is maintain knowledge about their local or state hazard mitigation plan so that they understand the context and characters of the problems that their local communities face. When you understand those contexts and characters, it allows you to understand possible solutions, low-hanging fruit, and longer-term aspirations. Given the challenges of climate change and other issues that our society face, dynamic changes like infrastructure degradation, increased costs, municipal burden and bureaucracy, long lead times and being able to procure materials that are necessary for construction projects, It's really important for us to be able to streamline as much as we can. And the best way that we can do that is to have an integrated practice across disciplines. What's really exciting to me about organizations like this and others that I belong to is this increased understanding that working together makes the work much lighter. I'm excited to share what we know from the emergency management field, but I'm also excited to learn from other fields like sociology, design and building. And I'm happy to share what we have cooking in the private sector for those of you that might be part of NGOs or the Ivory Tower. Working together makes things easier, and it also make it possible for us to deliver better benefits to those communities and constituencies that we serve.
That's wonderful, David. Timothy, over to you. How would you characterize the current state of the relationship between the emergency management field and the served public?
Oh, thank you. Thank you. Hi, my name is Tim Little. I work in emergency management, particularly in community recovery. And I've been doing it for, I don't know, 12 years, 13 years now. Not as long as David, but I also work very much in the public sector, working with communities as they kind of navigate through the recovery process and what that looks like for them, as every disaster is different and every community is different. And those needs are changing, and those needs change through a disaster. And so, helping communities navigate through that is something that I love to do, and something that I'm fortunately enough to be able to do. So, to kind of the question, I think, and I'm going to approach this from a public sector, kind of mentality. I think emergency management, like most things that happen at a governmental level, can be somewhat disconnected from the reality on the ground. One of the famous things, and this isn't just about emergency management, but about most large government endeavors, plans sometimes just sit on shelves, no matter what kind of plan they are. They could be an environmental plan, they could be a comprehensive plan, they could be a town plan, they could be an emergency management plan or a recovery plan or a mitigation plan. And unfortunately, a lot of times they sit on the shelf, and they're there because there was a statute or a law that said that had to be done, and no one ever looks at it. And then, a disaster happens and people go, didn't we have something somewhere on a shelf, And so unfortunately, I wouldn't say it's an ivory tower. I'd say it's more like a bunker. Sometimes emergency management likes to hide itself in a bunker and, you know, do the things, and then, hopefully a disaster doesn't happen. And, and if a disaster does happen, that we can be there to help. Hopefully that plan can be useful and be, help save lives. And, that's ultimately what it's for. But, unfortunately, sometimes those things are very disconnected.
And I like to characterize it really as there's a void in the expectation management between what the public sector expects the population to do, i.e., listen to my announcements, follow my directions. I'm the requisite or the local present authority. And unfortunately, what often happens is especially in today's world, we have switching over towards a culture of dependency where much of the population, every time we have a bump in the night, expects the government to act and to ameliorate everything. And so there seems to be this gap between the actual capability and capacity that exists within emergency management at the local and regional level and what the population thinks they actually are able to do. So often when we have great public sector responses to emergencies, you have this collapsing institutional trust because the public sector did everything they could, but the expectations of the population were so far outsized the capability of emergency management that even if they did everything they could, they would still fail to meet that. But part of that brings me to the next question. And Timothy, I want to throw this to you first.
Can I just add on to what you were saying, Jeff?
Yeah.
The other side to that is that sometimes we have disasters that go beyond the scope of any plan that we have ever planned.
Yeah.
And so, there may be expectation management on one side that, the public is saying, hey, why aren't you doing more? And the other side could be that we can't do more because we didn't even think this was remotely possible. Some of the things that they talk about, like if in the United States, like if Yosemite ever had the super earthquake, like no one is like that kind of an earthquake with the super volcano exploding kind of a thing, like what kind of a plan? No one is planning for that, I'm
Yeah.
just thinking out loud here, but sometimes the public sector isn't prepared for those huge things that can happen,
No,
so
and I think I just when I throw this next question back to you, you'll see the link to it. Often, based upon the idea that we're trying to get at in today's panel, is that there are multiple sectors to events. There are multiple sectors to society. And I've often said, and I've written much about this, that when a disaster happens, there are four distinct responses that occur. The public sector executes their public sector role. The corporate sector executes their role. The non-profit sector executes their role, and individual civilians execute their role. So you have four distinct and often uncoordinated response operations undergoing in the same community. But the big one that I think is drawing a lot of attention lately, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on this, is the private sector's role along the disaster continuum is not normally considered by most public sector agencies when they plan their response and recovery operations. How would you recommend the corporate world and public agencies come together? Because we know the corporate world has massive resources that often dwarf what the public sector has, but they're not included in the planning and the response and recovery. How would you see those two coming together in the planning stages? Let's say, let's keep it pre-event.
yeah, I think that begins at the local level. And so in a local emergency manager, for example, they should be working to bring in as many partners as possible from all those sectors. And oftentimes, sometimes that gets left behind, and sometimes we ignore the private sector, and we operate as if it's doing its own thing, and we're just going to let it do its own thing, and we're going to do our own thing, and we're going to worry about saving lives, and they're going to worry about keeping their businesses going or whatever. And that's, I think that is, such a large disconnect. And um, there's that famous example from Hurricane Katrina where Walmart was able to get supplies on the ground faster than the U.S. federal government, and like that. Like, is that the norm? Should that be the norm? I would say that's probably not the norm these nowadays. I mean, that's excuse me, Hurricane Katrina was 19 years ago. But like that's an example that people kind of have in their mind when they think about, oh, the corporate the world can do it much faster than the federal governments. And so, where is that fine line, and how do we like work with people? How do we inform folks to understand that, we need to work together? And so like I think it begins with local emergency managers when they are writing their plans to engage with their large corporate partners that are in their community. And that goes back to knowing their community. And so knowing the nonprofits, having regular citizens be part of their planning process, as well as engaging with large corporate organizations and companies that are there. And if they're not doing that, I mean, I would strongly recommend it. Because those resources, like for example, the Walmart one, Walmart is a store. There is a 90% of the United States population lives within 10 miles of a Walmart. And that if you can get stuff to a Walmart, you can then get stuff to people. And that's the federal and the government side aside. Like if you can have Walmart getting stuff to people, 90% of the population, I mean, like, why aren't we utilizing that as a resource? And I think that it's something that's been a work in progress. I know there are many private partnership organizations or groups that are starting to work together to try and bridge that gap. But there's obviously, as with everything in the public sector, there's so much more that we can do.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. David, I'd love to hear your thoughts on that. How do we get the private sector in the game, in the planning prior to the event occurring?
So I'm going to riff off of this in two different directions. One is small town business, local municipalities working on blanket contracts to restore services back into order, contractors and subcontractors, city employees, public works departments. but also from kind of my point of view, which is the 30,000 person architecture engineering firm. I'll tackle the first one first because I have a direct answer, which is to say, as a part of the American Planning Association, Michigan chapter, we found that we weren't achieving what we wanted to achieve on our resilience planning exercises above and beyond the traditional status quo hazard mitigation plans. What we did was we created materials for public sector to write better RFPs and to craft better scopes of work that really both work to do two things. One is precision, where they're able to articulate exactly what they're trying to achieve and clearly communicate that to contracting personnel. And then largely what that requires is removing the kitchen sink from your RFPs, where you're really kind of precise and saying, this is what I want to achieve in the scope of work. This is how I want to achieve it. Secondly, before issuing RFPs, work with local professional organizations or work with existing contractors to communicate and make sure that those RFPs and scopes of work have been socialized and understood properly before you're asking for proposals. So people really understand what you're asking for. And more importantly, this allows us to be able to articulate what it costs. People are oftentimes blindsided about how much it costs to do anything, right? Companies are large or small. Achieving anything is an incremental process that can be subdivided into smaller projects, working towards a larger program. But in order to do that, you really have to have your aspirations set, but you need to temper expectations so that people can deliver quality proposals. For small businesses, I'm going to kind of recommend, especially for companies that can't withstand even a disaster, much less a catastrophe, where they work with local partners or they work with close by stakeholders to have blanket service agreements. The most prototypical example I have of this would be water districts in Northern California. Maybe all of them can't plan to have their own vulnerability assessments. Maybe they all can't plan to have representatives after a disaster stand up for them and fill out all the paperwork and advocate for additional mitigations. But when working together as a consortia partnership, you're able to divide and conquer and make sure that you have the right people available if that wider consortia, any part of it, experiences a disaster. The side benefit of working with consortia is that puts you ahead of the curve when there's opportunities for mitigation funding and mitigation grants. When you're organized for a post-disaster scenario, that puts you in a strong position for contextualizing and characterizing your risk in a way that allows you to create contracts that could solve for those risks after a disaster, right? So that's the time to plan for hazard mitigation is not when your emergency operations center is underwater, right? That's the time for response and recovery. The time for mitigation and planning is before an event. A lot of times what I really advocate for is to harness the power of what I call recency bias. After there's a hurricane, everyone's afraid of hurricanes. After there's a cyber attack, everyone's afraid of cyber attacks. Those are the prime opportunities for folks in a consortia like this to advocate for their products, to advocate for their institutions, to have additional hardening and additional approaches to problems that maybe weren't expected before, but now are front and center because it happened to your neighbors to the east. Finally, I'd like to double down and say this working with your public-private partnerships and crafting memorandums of understanding is absolutely essential for harnessing the burden regionally across multiple people, stakeholders, and organizations after a disaster. The time to call your neighbor and ask to borrow their fire department is not after a hurricane. It's to figure out a strategy before the storm strikes.
Yeah, absolutely. And I would just say that this leads a lot into some of the questions that are popping up in the chat, and we'll get definitely to those when we get to the question and answer period. But if I can just kind of address a theme that's showing up there now is, how do we get these groups together? How do we create the system where these people want and have a purpose and initiative to come together? Because everybody has an interest in a better post-event outcome. Everybody has an interest when the community bounces back better. Let's be honest, from a capitalistic perspective, you don't make money when people can't buy anything and you can't sell anything when the system is down. And there's nothing wrong with being capitalistic. It's how we build society. But on the other hand, for the nonprofit groups, they require donations to be up and running. Donations require people to earn an income to provide those donations to not-for-profit. There is a symbiotic relationship here between all these sectors of society, but we often see them as separate, not connected on a Venn diagram. So a lot of this has to be done, in my mind, on the upfront pro bono. We're not paying companies to come to the table to have these conversations. One thing that I did think this conversation needs to talk about is we've seen reports lately in the OECD about falling institutional trust in public sector organizations tied to decisions pro or back and forth in the pandemic. And I don't want to get into the discussion about how the pandemic was conducted. It's just as a result of actions taken, we have a lower institutional trust. The challenge that I think we have in emergency management is the emergency management function gets painted with that same brush as institutional government does. So you get tied into the politicians. And Timothy, I'll throw this to you first. How do you think emergency management could address improving the institutional trust level with the served population, considering the reality of today's political and economic environment? What ideas would you think would be helpful in improving institutional trust in the EM function itself, separate and distinct from government?
Well, I think this goes back to my comment earlier about the operating at the local level. And so, and I think that means that your emergency manager, in the United States, a lot of times there's a county emergency manager or like a regional emergency manager. That means getting out there and making those relationships, meeting folks where they are, kicking the tires. As this is going to sound really funny, but it's Canadian, so hear me out. As Marshall from Paw Patrol would say, you got to kick the tires and fight some fires.
Yeah.
So I have small children at home, and so getting out there and meeting folks where they are, going businesses, meeting all your, like, literally walking the sidewalks and talking with folks, going into the barber shops, going into the small mom and pop restaurants, small mom and pop stores, and talking with folks and just kind of understanding, like, oh, what would happen? Do you have a business continuity plan? What would happen if we had a flood? Are you guys prepared for that? Do you have, are things off the ground? Do you have a generator? Do you have, kind of just working through some of those things. And then that can roll into a larger planning process down the road. But you've got to build those relationships, sometimes one at a time, sometimes in small groups. Hopefully, but that it just takes time. And unfortunately, in major disasters, in huge things that happen, those things, sometimes those things haven't been done. And so it becomes a very, command driven structure that can, remove trust and harm relationship, unfortunately. And so, my hope is that this begins at the local level. And, you've got folks out there who are wanting to get to know their emergency manager, or wanting to know, and that emergency manager is wanting to get to know them, because they can help leverage local resources, but then oftentimes, at least in the U.S., they're the conduit with which larger state and federal resources that get to the local level. And so by building those relationships, we could those resources can be delivered so much quicker. So again, to kind of back to your point, Jeff, it takes time, but it takes that one-on-one relationship and working hard to build that.
David, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, and I'll add and say, during response and recovery, command and control is necessary, right? There's a skill set that really brings solutions to the table, and people are still sort of at sorts if they don't have power in 3 days, even though us in the industry know you should be planning for 2 weeks, right? Especially when you're rural. Ignoring for a moment the importance of that command and control mentality across the entirety of the disaster resilience life cycle. There's a real important you got to show up for the state and local hazard mitigation planning meetings, right? The HMP plan is absolutely critical, fundamental, foundational to the work that we're doing in recovery. If whether or not you're part of the kind of standard process, that meeting is the number one place in which you're going to get incorporated into emergency management in a thoughtful way. You can also become CERT or Silver Jacket for engineers out there, but getting familiar with emergency management across disciplines starts with the emergency management plan. And I think really where it ends, and we in the resilience planning space are a step along the way, is trying to think differently about integrated design and to think differently about design excellence. I see someone's making comments about trauma-informed design in the chat. That's absolutely front and center right now. It's kind of as important as, let's call, resilience was a few years ago, and sustainability a few years before, and net zero a few years before that. What's really important to remember as we grow our disciplines out while they're part of the zeitgeist, while they're front and center in everyone's mind, that we continue to all work together as part of the larger integrated planning process so that we have as many bodies as possible, as many people making the connection, eating together, breaking bread together, making eye contact, getting on a Zoom call. These are the moments where the synapses are firing amongst the societal neural network that we are trying to create here. And it's absolutely essential for us to appreciate when concepts have their moment in the sun, right? There's never been a better time post-COVID to think about trauma-informed design, right? There's never been a better time to think about healthy communities. All of these people are working in a field that is central to what we're trying to achieve in resilience, while we try to think about how do we bounce back stronger from shocks and stressors, disasters, catastrophes, and emergencies. It's important not to forget about people during that process. And that's particularly important for a call like this, where we're trying to hold up the value of people working together and see that's really where the magic happens, where the rubber hits the road. But more conceptually, it's important to remember that we're all going towards the same aspiration. I call it design excellence. Other people call it different things, excellence in design. It's part of a wide process. And I'll put the snow cap of what design excellence looks like if I'm able to put a graphic in the chat, and you'll see each bullet in every silo that I'm about to put on the screen is actually a specialization that someone can go to college for, right? We could have a whole meeting on site selection and public bias in site selection, right? So
Yeah.
it's important to remember that we all have an important role to play, and we're all going to be playing the same sheet of music, playing from the same, or we all play on the same instrument towards building a better orchestra. That metaphor went the wrong way, but I think you guys.
No, I think we all get it, and I think some of the really interesting work, and this is going to bring me into another point that I think is important for us to talk about, is the latest research that Professor Aldrich and some others at Northeastern University are doing on the presence and the value of social infrastructure. I've often said and not argued, but really presented to emergency managers that if you're going to invest in one thing, you need to invest in community programming at your local community centers. And I don't mean disaster resilience programming. I mean programming that the community is seeking that will bring community members out from their residences into the common spaces, where we set up enabling environments where people will collide, where people will intentionally and unintentionally meet their neighbors, get together, become far more connected as a society. And some of the measures that we're looking at in the much discussed idea of how to measure social capital is kind of that presence of the social infrastructure. The number of parks, the number of community centers, the number of faith centers, the number of social businesses that drive people together. And it comes from a good friend of mine who's an emergency manager of a city in Canada here of 750,000. And he's clearly says if he spends more than 50% of his day in the office, he's failing his community. He can't execute the function of an emergency manager from a cubicle. He has to be out in the community, meeting the groups where they are, not inviting them into his office for a presentation, but going to sit in their meetings. So he's out and about in the community. And I think understanding that the role of social infrastructure, and David, I'm going to come back to you because you were really harping on this, and I think we really need to nail it. On top of that is the limited investments we can make in mitigation. I think a lot of that can be placed into the social infrastructure that will prove to be very, very valuable. Where would you see limited investment? Understanding the reality, as I said prior to the recording, is that as much as we would like to, the likelihood of emergency management receiving any significant additional funding is slim to nil, and Slim just left the building. So with the existing amount of money that exists, where do you think we can best put that to get the greatest community connectedness value? And I'll throw that to David first and then to Timothy.
Yeah, I like the question of where is the low-hanging fruit, because it's the one that I get the most, right?
Yeah.
How can I take a $10,000 job for 2K, right? I won't get too much into that, but I'll just straight up answer the question and say that I would find your local university. I would find the closest department related to the type of objective you're trying to achieve, and I would empower that department to do community-driven research. I think that's probably the lowest hanging fruit in terms of accomplishing three things. One is the university will typically deliver, right? It's going to be some student's primary focus for a whole year. Maybe it won't be as good as somebody that's done it 1,000 times before, but at least you're advancing the effort. Secondly, you're building up capacity in that individual as well, right? If you're allowing somebody to tackle a complex problem during undergrad or grad school, it may cause them to have some interest, and it may slingshot them so that when they're at the point of the career, they don't need somebody in the private sector explaining to them that they need to read the hazard mitigation plan, right? It gives them a head start. And then finally, universities are typically an integrator, a hub, and a network inside of a community. I think between a university and a public library, you're going to make a real difference in terms of doing outreach. I don't remember if I said this out loud before. I wrote a note to do it, but making the hazard mitigation planning process better can easily be achieved through a little bit of additional transparency, holding it at the university instead of the fire station, putting up a flyer in the library. And then one other item that I also forgot to mention previously is the power of the telephone, right? We've gradually gone into the era where our mailbox and junk mail just goes straight in the trash. Our email largely goes straight into the trash. If you really want to get somebody to show up, if you really want to get somebody to participate, you got to pick up the phone. And when you get that person on the hook, it's really important to empower them to work on what they're interested in working on. If you do that with enough people, you're going to build the consortia that I was talking about. Let people stand up for their own interests and passion and learn how to leverage that as an integrator and a leader. And you can make a lot of all of the existing capacity. Secondly, I'm going to emphasize it again. It's really important for anybody writing RFPs or anybody writing scopes of work. And it's important on our side of the business, the people that are reading RFPs and responding to scopes of work, to really start thinking about how do we zoom in on these things to achieve tangible steps, effort by effort. And I'll point back to the graphic I put in the chat. There's a lot that goes into building a resilience hub in your public library. You really need to understand the wider design process and the importance of initial strategy and fundraising, site selection. All of these exercises are absolutely essential, because the most expensive thing you can do, the most unsustainable thing you can do, is rework, right? So if you find yourself far down the line, all that money, and you made a big mistake, all that effort was wasted. And that is it's more important to be organized than to figure out what's the biggest bang for the buck.
Yeah, absolutely. Timothy, what do you think on that?
I think, I mean, David, that was beautiful. But to add to that, I mean, I think, the question of how do we leverage the public sector to build better social capital I mean, I feel like that's the holy grail of this special interest group, and so like, I grabbed my copy of Aldrich's book, Building Resilience, and you know, looking through it, I'm like, oh, you're right. There's a lot of good stuff in here. Hold on, let me just, how can I apply this to my everyday work, Um, but I think one of the things that's in there quite a bit is like local leadership development. And whether that comes, I'm not saying that needs to come from a federal source or from a state source or a local, it can come from any source. It can come from the Chamber of Commerce, you doing like young professionals networks, like young professional networks where they get everybody who's, under 40 that's starting in their, or under 30 that's starting a new job or starting in, in their career, and they get them together and they say, let's connect you. And let's connect you with mentors, and let's help you. And just by building those relationships, it builds trust. And when we build trust, we can then, especially in this kind of field, we can leverage that trust to, help communities and help survivors recover faster from disasters. Another example, in Texas, there's something called the Rural Leadership Program, and it's through the Texas State, Texas A&M University. Sorry, oof, my brain just like Texas A&M University. And what it is it's a program the school funds does themselves, and counties or cities that are in rural, like very rural, like under 20,000 people in a county apply, and then they start like they'll bring experts and they'll bring like leadership development folks to that county, and they'll start like a cohort, and they'll work through like how to affect change in your local government, how to affect change in your local community, and they'll train local folks on that kind of stuff. And that brings folks who are interested who might not know each other together. They'll be building trust, and then that trust can be leveraged to do change and create change in their communities. And so, there's lots of little tiny examples that I'm sure all of you know of, that are happening in your neck of the woods. And so, like, how do we do that better? How do we get those groups connected? How do we leverage that? I think it goes back to like then that your local emergency manager needs to know about that and be engaged in that kind of work. And that again, that back to that local person who's out there kicking the tires, and fighting fires. And so, um, sorry, but it's just that, oftentimes I think there was a quote actually in Aldrich's book, that I just like found earlier today. I mean, I've seen it before, but it just hit me kind of differently. And he's talking about, oftentimes for the last almost century and a half or last 50 years, we've been doing emergency management in a way where we only are really concerned about infrastructure, and we are ignoring the social fabric that is inherent and part of everyday human life, as part of our communities, as part of everything. And it's like, how do we get emergency management to think more about the social infrastructure, the social network, ultimately social capital? And so I was just taken aback by him writing that, and I think this book is like 12 years old or something.
Yeah.
And I was like, man, oh, that just
Yeah.
slaps, so. Or
That's such a powerful quote, and it gets to the importance of relationships. And I mean, that's the principal basis of our social capital connections is, and part of the questions is how do we do this? And I've seen it work in two areas up here in Canada very, very well. One is it's longitudinal. The successful areas didn't really declare success for 7 to 9 years. So this is not something that happens overnight. And we have to accept that you can't bring everybody to the table. But now these two communities are in a position where groups are fighting to get access to the table to talk about resilience in their community because of how important and how engaged it is. It just takes the time. Part of what, and I think it was both David and Timothy said earlier, that often what happens is the emergency manager doesn't get connected to the communities they serve, often because what they're stuck doing is regulatory compliance, regulatory work. They're filling out forms, they're answering to a higher responsibility, they're executing tasks in accordance with the legislation that governs how they deliver their services to the people. They don't have the opportunity to go out And I'm a retired military officer. And one of the things that I try to translate over was something that we used to call intelligence preparation of the battle space, which means before the military would conduct an operation in an area, it needs to know absolutely everything about it, from the people, the culture, the terrain, the weather, the effects, the economy. We want to know all of that information. So I often take that over and translate it to the emergency manager. We're trying to teach them intelligence preparation of the disaster space. So if they're responsible for a certain geographical area, then their cultural aspects, the economic aspects, the political aspects, the needs, and who's who in the community is very, very important to build those relationships. But it's often difficult to figure out, as Timothy, I think you said, who do I talk to? If I'm an emergency manager, who is it that I should be talking to? And what I often start with is to go back a point I made earlier is I really think the best friend of the local emergency manager needs to be the head of the local chamber of commerce, because they represent, as David said, a lot of the small independent businesses who can't advocate on their own. Not the Walmarts of the world, but all of the small independent pieces that offer a part of resiliency. And I'm going to throw this question to you, Timothy, in a second. But we often see that in operations, what's happens a lot has happened a lot in our evacuation here in Canada is that we evacuate the very same capability that we hire. So we'll evacuate the heavy equipment operators out of town with their families, and then we'll hire all the heavy equipment from 2 hours away and truck it in when the community had all the resources it needed to respond and didn't actually require external assistance, but it was its own evacuation that put it in that case. So, Timothy, do you really think if we understood a better list and knowledge of what was in the communities, that our response operations could be far more effective just from becoming more aware of what's resident in the area?
100%, Jeff. I think we've actually talked about this before in the past. It's, you know, most of the things that a community needs are already there in the community.
Yeah.
They're just underutilized. And most of the things that can help a community get from point A in a recovery process to point Z in a recovery process, probably a lot of them are already there, or the people already have the expertise, and maybe they just need some guidance. They maybe need some encouragement and support, some peer-to-peer mentoring from other folks who've been in disasters. But for a lot of the times, the knowledge and the information knowledge is there. Like you've got the right people. They've got good experience. They're knowledgeable people. They've got, you know, like as you said, heavy equipment operators. There are heavy equipment operators in that town. There are firefighters in that town, you know. And so like, why would we ignore those needs? And so ignore those people when there are needs in their local community. And so 100% you are on it. And I think it's, again, I'm gonna keep harking on this, man. I'm just gonna keep saying it over and over. It takes that local emergency manager getting to know folks, and again, that takes time. That can take years of building relationships.
Yeah.
I love that story of your friend who says, if I'm not out of the office 50% of the time, I'm not doing my job. I'm like, that's brilliant. Like, that's 100% on point. And I wish more folks were like that. And I wish more folks were recognizing that they need to be out in their community, because there aren't, if the emergency manager's not out there doing it, who is doing it for that community, you know?
Yeah.
And I'll double down on blanket service agreement, which is to say, if you want to make sure you're going to secure your local folks, reach out to them before disaster strikes so that they know that they have this responsibility and that they know they have an opportunity to engage on the contract quickly and efficiently without the competitive procurement process. So we have a real firm understanding of who's doing what, and then we don't wait 6 weeks and then all the homeowners are getting their roofs repaired, and now there's no contractors left to do the library, right? So all of these types of little mechanisms, these little types of steps that seem very boring when you're doing them proactively, are the low-hanging fruit that you're picking that's making a really big difference. If you know that your library is in the 100-year flood zone and you don't have a plan for repairing it, don't repair it in place. Use the time pre-disaster to find a site that's outside of a vulnerable area. These are the little things that's so easy to do in advance and so impossible to do after disaster strikes. Contract and governance mechanisms in particular. If you have to get 3 bids to build a new roof on your library and there's only 2 contractors in town that can do it, what's the plan, right? What's the plan?
Yeah, and that's so true. And I wanted to have a chat now, and I think part of how we do it is figuring out that mechanism. And I want to introduce a concept and get David your comments on this first. I've been a proponent and I've written a couple of articles about something that I'm referring to as community response councils. It's a formal non-governing body where all 4 sectors of society that we mentioned, the private sector, the public sector, the not-for-profit, and residents themselves, are present to discuss how response and recovery operations could be conducted in the future. They build relationships with each other. They foster trust, all in times of peace and calm. And this is the idea of a group of prominent people from society, all 4 sectors sitting around a table saying, what would response look like in our community? What's the likely number 1 hazard? What would response look like? How would you do this? And it speaks to command and control, because we know command and control is important. But in a disaster, the only thing the public sector commands is public sector assets. They have no authority over businesses. They have no authority over not-for-profits and no authority over the civilians. They only command their own assets. So if we could get the community together in a council, and I characterize it as non-governing body, because as soon as you assign it the responsibility to make the laws, all of everybody's little lobbying events come up and their positions start being formulated to get the best benefits. But when it's just a discussion forum where all members of the community can get together to have that very specific set of discussions, I think it's something that we can bring on. You can call it whatever you will. But David, I just throw the question to you. Have you ever seen anything like this work in your experience? That's
Works, works every time. People
okay.
get upset. People feel like they've been done wrong in the face of disaster, because frankly, no one's going to make you whole except for yourself, right?
Yeah.
Governments have the responsibility of protecting the public good and being guardians of the public trust. For every success we see with like Michigan Central, there's an equal story with someone embezzling money for the the Detroit Riverfront Conservancy. It appears secret. It appears hard to penetrate. Yes, because it's become professionalized. Yes, because it takes money to accomplish anything. And yes, because increasingly it takes additional skills and understanding of nuanced public policy in order to tackle kind of everyday problems in terms of coordinating between the public and the wider body of representatives that stands to protect their interests, right? So it's really important for us to think about the fact that we're all just people, right? The government's not out to get us. We're here to help, right? And that the real way to solve problems is to be more proactive, is to be more involved. And if you don't have the bandwidth because you have a child screaming in the background, then there's a real opportunity for you to understand where your skills fit best. When I think about what the role of social capital is during the process of disaster recovery and disaster planning, I think it really comes back to letting people be strong where they're strong and not force them to do work where they don't have the passion, the momentum, or even the understanding in some cases. So I think the ultimate message that I would want to get across to folks like y'all is the institutions are in place for a reason. Max Weber would call it politics is a slow bore against a hard wood, right? And that's intentional. And the only way to get about it is to become a master of your craft and to help the communities that you serve also become experienced and understanding about what needs to be achieved in the face of disaster. Sure, it's easy to, an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. That's why we're all here today, is to figure out really what is that calculus. But when it really comes down to it, after catastrophic impact, there's going to be pain all around. And we really just need to work to decrease that pain, more efficiently and effectively mobilize, And then to be able to really think about people first, right? Center on home and recovery instead of the systems and bureaucracy. And I think we'll see a real market change, not only in kind of the metrics that we use to govern our future activities, but also perception, right? So we got to tackle both realities and perceptions. The best way to do that is through data-driven assessment and science-based research. That can't be done without a coalition of folks working together to make sure that we don't have a garbage in, garbage out type problem.
That's so true. Timothy, you work a lot in the communities. Have you ever seen a case or an
I
example
have.
of where somebody has done this well?
Actually, I've seen it a couple of different places across the U.S. Yeah, I was in Illinois, working with a community, and they had asked me, "Hey, can you come talk to us about like beyond like beyond mitigation?" Like they were interested in like recovery planning, but they hadn't had a disaster. And I was like, absolutely. Like, who's the audience? And they're like, oh, they're like, oh, we invite folks from the private sector. I've got NGOs here. I've got the hospital here. I've got, the police and the fire department. And I was like, this is kind of awesome.
Yeah.
And, and it was just like this council that the emergency manager had started. And it didn't have power. It was just they had started gathering this sector together of people who were like-minded and who would be involved if something had happened. And it was a really good group of like, I don't know, 35 people that got together like every quarter. And they wanted to work together. But then the emergency manager was relying on their expertise and was relying on their knowledge base, and the connections that those folks had bringing to the table. And it was like, man, you guys are like way ahead of the curve. And I've seen that. I've seen it in a couple of places, honestly, throughout the U.S. I can't speak to Canada, unfortunately. I haven't worked there um, yet, but I I I I I think it's kind of, at least in the U.S., a lot of times it's up to the local emergency manager to build those networks out. But I have seen it, and it's really cool because it lets them leverage what's already there in their community, and helps them get information out, but then also get work out and work together at the local level across sectors. And yeah, I have seen it. It's not everywhere, but I've seen it in some examples, or a few examples.
And I think that's where we need to be doing a better job of amplifying those, of codifying them and capturing them. Now, I know there is some research in the academic world where they're looking at the involvement of community councils, but that's often very difficult to measure in a scientific process. To say, let's look at a group of communities that have these councils, let's have a group of communities that don't have these councils, let's hope everybody goes through a disaster, because without a test, that's the difficult in scientific research and disaster management, is I need you to go through an event so I can see whether these things are effective or not, which is the unfortunate part about it. But don't worry, we have enough to go around. We just need to figure out who's going to get hit before they get hit, which I wish we knew. But, this all comes down to that connection of, a lot of the times the community has a set of priorities that may not fall perfectly in line in what the structural ideal of emergency management believes is a priority for reestablishing sectors of critical infrastructure. Now, the research that I've done is zeroed in on mirroring and matching those two, matching the list that the community would like versus a list what the emergency management would like. And one example that I found in one county where because they were rural, transportation links were the most important things to them. They wanted to get to their neighbors, they wanted to check on each other, and those transportation links were the key. The community emergency management was following the playbook that the power was the most important thing to restore first. So they were throwing the kitchen sink, to quote that reference, at the power grid when the community was fine, like, leave that down for a couple of days. That's not really our concern. We want the roadways open. So one party was diligently working as hard as they could at something that was simply not the priority of the served community. And that wouldn't have been noticed or talked about until those two groups got into the same room and had a conversation. And then emergency management can say, hey, this is our rationale why. So maybe we will get the hospital water treatment plant hooked up right away. But then we'll swing, as we say in the Army, we'll swing fire over to the community's priority of the transportation and get those linked open. And then you start to see that institutional trust improve because communities see themselves in the emergency management plan. They see their interests there. They see their main concerns being solved. And to quote a stalwart voice in the industry, Damon Coppola, he talks about, and he's posted this on LinkedIn not too long ago, in a resilient community, emergency management is the redundancy, not the primary response organization. The community is the primary response organization, and the emergency management is the redundancy if necessary. And I think it's important to say that. And I'll just go around to get one final comments on that from David and then Timothy. Because if we don't truly understand what is the goal we're trying to achieve here, then it's very difficult to measure if what we're being successful is moving towards it. So, David, what are your thoughts on that as EM being the redundancy in a resilient community?
Since I've already touched on the participate in the hazard mitigation planning process and reach out to your local emergency manager, I'll touch in and say, what can we do better during the process? And I think you really put your finger on it when you said, when I reached out to this community, their rural interests were different than the urban interests, right? And that is something I actually use the urban-rural transect as an organizing principle for relating solutions to folks in the built environment, because it can be way easier to convince someone living suburban or rural to get their own emergency generator and to let them know, hey, you're last in line. We're restoring power based on population density. You are the lowest population density. You're going to come last. It's your personal responsibility to keep your own power. And then that allows people to focus on, let's say, transportation or another priority. It's really critical to move beyond contextualization and characterization. And folks that are new to the resilience or disaster risk reduction field really like to get wrapped up in constantly regurgitating items that are already probably pretty well articulated by emergency management professionals, right? If you're a novice, it's really easy to get caught up on a map that shows where floods are, right? It's really important for people to understand, yes, you have a part in that process, but you can't just constantly update this. This is where our vulnerabilities are. You have to work diligently across plans and across disciplines and across agencies and across constituencies, working together with thoughtful governance and appropriate funding in order to achieve change to the status quo. You need to move from left to right on the progress scale. I call it moving from consensus building to action orientation. For any of you that have ever been part of any planning process, I'm sure that you've been part of the endless community meetings that really perpetuate the reports that end up on the shelves that Tim mentioned earlier, right? We got to get out of our own way. We got to stop getting mad at everybody. Stop yelling at your politicians. Stop accusing your emergency managers of not understanding where they are. Meet people where they are and progress towards shared aspirations together, right? You don't need agreement on everything to work together on aspirations that you share, but it is absolutely critical to make even small progress towards an understanding of basic things like, how long do I need to be planned? How long do I need to plan for my power being out, right? And if we can start to nip some of these problems in the bud, if we can start to explain to people that it is their trees in their yard that are causing the power outage during winter storms, then we can really start to make a difference in the way that our infrastructure, our social systems, and our expectations as a society really work towards the ends of keeping our populations safe, comfortable, and ultimately resilient, right? We need to stop beating around the bush, stop doing endless studies, and start working together towards achieving our ends. And in order to do that effectively, we as communities need to support our government in the creation of public policy and request for proposals that protect our social and our community infrastructure. period. Like, the time for endless conversation is over. The time to empower technical specialists and people within your community to make an actionable change is now. And if you can actually demonstrate that, if you can show that you have capacity to deliver, it's going to be way easier for you to secure financing, whether that's publicly attained or done through the support of a government and community.
Absolutely. And part of securing, when you have a common voice, it is far easier to put forward a case for any type of funding that may be available, even in these traditional grant applications. When you come with a combined effort from all sectors of society, that looks different than just one organization looking for money to buy a new generator, as you say, instead of the community saying, we've here the whole community has this, we've gone across the community, these are the community needs, we've put them on a priority basis, and we have a community plan going forward. Timothy, what do you think about that comment I made about resiliency, EM being redundant, or the
I'm gonna
redundancy?
need you to, can you write it in the chat, because I'm gonna have to borrow it because it was so good. I'm truly flabbergasted by it. And I like, I absolutely, I think that is the goal. Like, and if we're not striving towards that goal, like, are we just spinning our wheels? Like, I'm just like questioning everything. It's like an existential question that's like really throwing me for a loop, Jeff. Um,
Well, the whole idea, but that's good, because I think this is what we need to do as we wrap up this conversation. We're very shortly going to go to the question and answer period to hopefully address everybody's question. And if I miss it in the chat, we'll get to that in a second. I think it's really important, because if we don't challenge the existing way the structure is organized and the way we build relationships, we're going to rinse and repeat, as I like to famously say. Every hurricane season is going to look like the last one. Every more Oklahoma tornado is going to look like the next one. Every wildfire in California is going to look like the next one. And we're going to ask ourselves why we didn't learn anything, because we're defining Einstein's ridiculous idea of insanity every time, because we continually approach the recovery and the response in the very same way every year, despite how poorly the community sees it done. So I think we need to challenge it. And hopefully individuals that were here, individuals that are watching this later on the YouTube broadcast, find this type of panel helpful, find this type of challenging discussions that we have, and people being open and honest about what we see as issues and how we challenge the existing paradigm to improve things, because I think we're all working towards better post-event outcomes. So I'm going to take this opportunity before we get to question and answer to thank David and Timothy for joining me for this hour in this wonderful conversation. Hopefully the first of many that we're going to have in the Disaster Resilience Special Interest Group about important things about resilient communities and how we improve better post-event outcomes, because I really think in the end, that's how we measure things. How do we limit the damage and suffering? Because you can't prevent suffering and you can't prevent damage. There always will be some, but it's about mitigating it to the best extent possible. Now, I'm going to look at I'm going to roll back a bit in the questions. And if I miss your question, feel free to jump right in and put it at the bottom of the chat, because I may have gone by it. But the first question that I see in there that we haven't addressed is from Kiyomi. Now, I'll give you the opportunity to hop off the mic and answer it ask it yourself, but it was your question related to how do we pay for and fund private sector involvement in disaster response. So I'll ask it, and basically the question was how do we go about funding the private sector's involvement in disasters, in that initial response and recovery operation? How do we do that? David, I'll throw it over to you. How do you think we do that without needing three quotes, without having to go through, what does that new process we need look like?
A hard question. I think in an ideal world, and I hinted at it earlier, we would have pretty comprehensive plans for public and community infrastructure even when we haven't identified it as a vulnerable space, an exposed space, or a high-risk space. Oftentimes, our approach in the command and control, disaster management, disaster risk reduction space is to prioritize, right? Where you're trying to take the most high likely, high impact, high probability events, organize those in descending order, and then do a similar exercise for high value, high connectivity, critical infrastructure with ripple effect and domino effect, which I'd love to talk about extensively. And then you tackle kind of from the top to bottom, right? How do you prioritize what you invest in? High risk, high vulnerability, high cost, critical infrastructure. People often throw around the terminology all hazards planning or all hazards approach. And there's no circumstance in which you can plan for all in events, right? There's this black swan Taleb type theory that underpins that bold statement. I think if we're able to do comprehensive planning, similar to how we've been doing currently, emergency management, hazard mitigation planning, similar to how we've been doing, that could be complemented by a lot of what y'all are mentioning today, harnessing the value of local communities working on this stuff anyway.
Yeah.
Right? Like people want better schools, right? People want schools that their basements aren't flooding all the time. The work you're doing to secure financing, to do thoughtful site selection, to do thoughtful retrofit of existing community properties, to maximize flex spaces. All of this kind of pre-planning work in advance of disaster can be leveraged after disaster, but it also works to articulate cost effectiveness. I threw out that hypothetical earlier about the emergency operations center in the basement that keeps flooding. They have a very convincing $10 million story that says if my emergency ops center gets flooded like the town to the west did last month, I'm going to lose contact with 10,000 people. That loss of contact is going to result in X impact for mortality and morbidity. And I can calculate that, even though it's an intangible, to really do a convincing cost estimate for the benefit that I'm articulating here. That's great. And I think you're telling a convincing story. What's more important is if we were all going to meetings, if we were leveraging the social capital, even just within government, we might be able to find that the Emergency Operations Center isn't the only group that's flooding. It's also the fire station and dispatch and EMS and the dialysis center. And instead of each one of them submitting a $10 million proposal to their local government for the monies that they need, they could be more effectively coordinating together and building a campus for about half of that cost. Right?
Yeah.
These are the types of conversations that needs to happen before you bring a large 30,000 person AEC firm into the table, because then you're paying my salary to explain the basics to you, instead of paying my salary to be able to build a comprehensive campus that can address all the needs of those different agencies at the same time. Work that you do in the trenches really adds up. The problem is that we're not effectively using systems and governments as simple as scopes of work to leverage existing works. It's a relay race where the NGOs pass to local government passes to state government passes to federal government, they pass to a local contractor who is working alongside a large organization who comes to the table and the scope of work is all wrong. Right?
Yeah. Yeah.
The type of stuff where I'm just saying, in order to do this type of work on the left hand of the diagram that I put in the chat earlier, you don't need to hire expensive consultants to do that work. You just need to do that work, right? You need to be thoughtful. You need to leverage your communities in a way that they feel like they can be YIMBYs instead of NIMBYs. And then you're not wasting all your time having community meetings where you're put on a pedestal as the villain for somebody's property tax value going up.
Yeah.
Right?
And
It's a lot of complicated issues that need addressed. And the only way we're going to be able to address them is through the sweat equity of folks like us connecting with those those technical experts if and when we need them.
And just give a quick example, and then I want your thoughts there, Timothy. This is quite the best replication. This leads to another question by Kamea Crawford that's in the chat about trends across local governments to minimize social infrastructure loss. There was a case in the Caribbean. So if you think a lot of the underdeveloped Caribbean islands get smoked by a hurricane, everything gets blown down, and there's never going to be enough money to make every building and every home resilient to hurricanes. It's just it's not probable, and it can't be done. So what the World Bank funding went towards is they realized that the schools were the community centers of the location. So they built robust schools that could take a direct hit from a Category 5 hurricane. But they built a couple extra rooms on there, so the EOC is in there. All the shelter equipment is stored inside the hospital. So they accepted the fact that most of the homes from the direct hit are going to be destroyed. Most of the businesses are going to be destroyed. But everything the community needs for the immediate response is encased in a building that can take a direct hit, has its own power, has its own medical facilities, and has everything. So they took that small amount of money that was available and realized, how can we get our best bang for the buck on the ground in these Caribbean islands? Which, by the way, if you're ever looking for great regional work, look for CDEMA, the Caribbean Disaster Emergency Management Agency. And if you look at all of the hurricanes that have come through in the last number of years, not one has required an international response operation run by the UN or any other major multilateral organization, because even with a Category 5 direct hit, their own regional plan and their own regional response and recovery operations are sufficient to take care of themselves. Now, yes, they have some European help, et cetera, but they're able to do that. And so we have examples for that. Timothy, I'd love to hear your thoughts.
I was kind of thinking of it in a kind of the question in a little different bit of a way, or a different kind of way. I think oftentimes, if you're say again, a local emergency manager who is trying to engage with their community, I think your private sector folks want to be there. I think they want to be invited to those kinds of meetings because it's good PR for them. And it's good that they're involved with their community. Now, sure, there could be examples of businesses that don't want to be, sure, but I would say by and large, I would imagine most corporations want to be part of those conversations, because what affects the community affects their business. In fact, what affects their business affects their bottom lines. And I think the only thing that's preventing them from being involved is not being asked. And so I would say invite them. And I'm positive that most of them will show up. And if you put food on the table, then even more of them will show up, so
you just need trays of cookies and everybody comes. I mean, you just find
exactly.
your great baker in town. Well,
Exactly.
I couldn't agree more with you, because I've written a couple of articles about the fact that there's often this ideological barrier in emergency management to the profit motive. And every time the profit motive comes up, they think that companies are there to prosper and gain off of Naomi Klein's old, decade-old book on disaster capitalism. But when we think about, just like you said, Timothy, the businesses, but they're residents of the town. Their employees live in the town. The owners live in the town. They rely on the town. They're part of it, and part of our barrier in the emergency management field is getting over that ideological idea of the profit mode. It's the same reason why it's built into the grant structure system, at least here in Canada, and probably is in the United States, that if you want to apply for a grant, you need to be a not-for-profit. You can't be a for-profit corporation and apply for a government grant to improve your preparedness. So what you have to do is, now you're forcing everything through this one funnel that may not have the resources, because we're afraid of the profit motive. Though I've never known a not-for-profit to go broke in my life over this type of grant application. They do very, very well for themselves. But part of that issue is just that. And I think, and I'm going to move over to the one question I'm going to ask Timothy, you first, comment on this. And it's from Kiyomi. And it's a question about, how do we measure community resiliency? Because I struggle with this, and I would love your idea on it. Vulnerability indexes, resiliency indexes, social capital indexes. How do we go about codifying some measurement tool for community resilience? And in your idea, just off the top of your head, what do you think that would look like?
I mean, I think I'm not there's somebody's out there who's smarter than me, who has a lot of algorithms that has figured out how to weigh different indices. I will say Dr. Aldrich did just publish an article on mapping social infrastructure and social capital in the US. It's like last week or so. I just dropped it in the chat. And so I saw it and I was like, what is this? But I've, FEMA has done some resilience um, uh, GIS products that you can access. And David and I both dropped a lot of them in the chat. The resilience analysis and planning tool is a GIS product. The National Risk Index is another product. And some of those are looking at like the number of disasters that have hit in a community, the infrastructure that is currently there, and then some of them, I mean, other folks are doing really cool things on the other side. They are looking at the taking zoning maps, and they're using LiDAR, and they're looking at like building density and building types, and they're running that against floodplains and they're mapping in different, kind of different scenarios that can happen. I'm not one of those people, but there are really smart people out there doing those kinds of things. And so the ones that we've listed, several of those are from the government has done, and obviously I don't know all the private ones that do exist, but I know that those are also out there.
And I'm going to throw this to David because I know he works in the grant industry, and I know this is going to drive him nuts. But I was thinking, what would the world look like if we built a resiliency index and just funded grants automatically on a per capita basis and remove the entire grant application, grant award, grant verification, and compliance system, and just, as we say en français, dans la poubelle, we throw all of that in the garbage and just grant communities a resiliency funding based upon their risk profile and their per capita, and leave it at that, and take all of that resources that are involved in those grant applications and put them aside. David, I'd love to hear your thought on that.
Corruption and
Okay.
cronyism
Cronyism, yeah.
would prevail, right? People will figure out how to manipulate systems and how to edge the poor out, right? We need to have government. We need to have government employees as the vanguard making decisions about public policy investments, period, right? We don't need less government. We need more collaboration. And that's what I think this organization is all about, right? And I think there's a lot of expertise and a lot of people out in government working to help, right? We're all in this together. These are our neighbors and our families that we're protecting. And oftentimes, every day you turn on the news and you see another unsuspecting family impacted by disaster. We're not in this to kind of perpetuate bureaucracy. We're in this type of work so that we can really make a difference in everyday people's lives. Oftentimes, we in government, I'm a contractor, but we're put into a situation where we have to go into the field and make eye contact with people post-disaster, right? And that's it's it's a traumatizing exercise, frankly. And I think that we really need a little breath of fresh air, and this kind of anti-government sentiment that I'm kind of getting a sense of in from everywhere, from my community meetings to Reddit, right? Like, people are working
Reddit.
really hard. People are working really hard to make a difference. I think there's an opportunity for us to connect with both experts and local NGOs to really make a difference, to make this less of a relay race where it's going from one hand to another, and more of like a crew exercise where we're all paddling in the same direction in the same time towards the same place. I do think that there's changes that we can make to public policy. I think there's much simpler changes that we can make to project management and program management to make a difference. What do you do to achieve resilience on your projects and programs? You do it every intersection at a time. You do it every single project at a time. In order to do that effectively, we need to bring everybody together to make sure that our projects, large and small, are working towards the public good. The best way to understand that is to do things together.
And I agree. Do you think it's well mapped though? And part what I mean about mapped is part of, I think, the challenge with institutional trust and I get the same sense as you, people calling for, let's crush government, get them out of the way and do it ourselves, because obviously we can do it better. But the idea behind it is a lot of times the policy matrix and what's can be seen as a burdensome set of policy processes, procedures aren't well laid out, so the community members, who in the end as taxpayers fund all of this anyhow, look at this system and they don't see a roadmap. We're building a resilient community in the following 7 steps. We're at step 2.5 right now in my community. The neighboring one might be at 3, but we're all on this very clear laid out road. It just doesn't seem like, and it's not due to fault. Again, it's just asking an emergency manager to do one more task that they currently don't have time for. But the issue is that when the community sees that we're part of a logical plan that we've laid out for them, that we're building the resilient community in this fashion through these grants, through these programs, through this process, it makes a sense, I think. And what my qualitative interview tells me is that people just don't get it. They don't understand how all of this is going to translate into a resiliency. And I'm going to go to Timothy and then back to David. What do you think of that?
Yeah, yeah, kind of, well, back to the first part of the question. Um, you know, I don't know. I'm kind of at a loss of words. Because I don't want to dig myself into a hole.
Don't, don't.
Um, but yeah, I'm gonna pass. I'm gonna pass on that.
Okay. And David, just, do you think maybe I could phrase it better. Is there a better proactive way to explain how all of this will lead to a resilient community instead of this is just what we do and how we're organized?
These are the steps here. Define your problem, assemble your evidence, construct alternatives, choose criteria, project outcomes, confront the trade-off, decide, and tell your story. If you can't get through the simple process of identifying what it is you want to achieve and be able to articulate your narrative in a compelling way, then you're going to have to go a very strange route to get people to buy in to your proposal, right? I call those shadow approaches, when you whisper something into somebody's ear 8 times until they make it their own idea, right? It's really important for us to remember that there are institutions in place, that there are processes to be followed. They're not that difficult. I don't believe in this knowledge barrier, right? Go to the public library, check out a book on how to fill out the paperwork, right? Go to the website, like, do the reading. I don't think it's necessary for government or experts or academics or even neighbors to spoon feed people with the necessary tools in order to make a positive change in their community. I think it's a shared responsibility. I think it's an expensive proposition. And I think we all need to be willing to understand what the trade-offs are and agree them to build consensus as a community. And most importantly, move towards action orientation, right? So we need to drive positive decision-making towards consensus building, typical planning processes. Go to the American Planning Society PAS reports, and there's beaucoup ways of engaging thoughtfully and effectively, and to use those tools that are pretty readily available to everyone. Yeah, the cost is the value even when you choose not to decide, you still have made a choice, right? These are all kind of very common principles. It's really easy to get caught up in analysis paralysis. It's really easy to get wrapped around the axle with NIMBYism, right? But all of us together working towards a shared objective with the evidence to support the approaches and the proposals that we suggest as the best alternative is the path forward, right? There is no silver bullet, right? You're not going to find some sort of silver bullet, even if you spend $2 million chasing after it. It's iterative, incremental, positive progress in areas where we know we can make a good difference together, using co-creation and collaboration. All tools easily available in the skill sets of many of our disciplines: emergency management, planning, environmentalism, public finance, nonprofit management. We're all doing the same stuff. Just need to coordinate better.
And coordination, I mean, that's the entire purpose of our conversation. I think we're just gonna, unless somebody has a question to throw into the chat, and I think Bridget put it perfectly to say measuring resilience is a very complex idea because there's so many variables, so many intersections, so many dependencies, so many assumptions that people make. And a resilient community in a rural area, as David said, is not going to look like a resilient community in an urban area. And as Timothy has said throughout today, it is so much about the local frame. It is so much about our local community and how we help our neighbors out. Because remember, stats are clear. Almost 90% of the people taken out of wreckage of an earthquake are taken out by their neighbors, not by Hussar and USAR teams that come in or CERT trained teams. They get the hard to reach people by time CNN shows up for the hit, but all the other people have already been pulled out of the rubble by their neighbors. So it's their community together that does all of that wonderful work. So I want to take this. Thank you, everybody, for joining us at this special interest group. I want to thank David and Timothy for agreeing to be on this panel and for being blunt and honest, which I think is something key we need to be doing in this space, to have the honest, difficult, challenging conversations that will say to the paradigm, maybe that you haven't been doing it wrong, but maybe there's a different way to doing it. Or as David says, and I'll try to paraphrase you here, that the system's not broken. It's there, it works, and it moves the goalposts along. We just need to be doing a better job, as Timothy says, explaining the world to everybody as it exists. So I'll close off with a call for anybody who enjoyed this and wants to join us again to hop over to the Mighty Networks platform that's available, the chat at the beginning of the chat. To set up a free profile to join us over there at the Disaster Resilience Special Interest Group community. We post there regularly. If you're on LinkedIn, there is a private group for the Disaster Resilience Special Interest Group. You can Google it, sign it there, send it there. I will most certainly approve your admittance into the group. We do a little bit of conversation there as well. And we are planning the next iteration of the special interest group panel along this lines. As long as everybody thinks it's a great idea to have more of these discussions, we're going to do that in March. Nearing the third week of March, we're going to have the next iteration of this. We're going to have a group of panels together and continue the resiliency discussion. So, and I love the fact that Max Weber made it into the conversation. It just makes my night. That's wonderful. Who doesn't love a good Max Weber fight? So with that, I want to thank everybody. Thanks for joining us. Have a great night, and we can see you all online or in March. Have a great holidays, Merry Christmas, and Happy New Year.